Hello Year 10 historians. Today we're going to be talking about source analysis and in particular analysing cartoons. Political cartoons. Yeah. Okay. Some learning goals for today. You're going to know the questions that you should ask yourself when analysing a cartoon. You're going to know the skills involved when analysing a cartoon. And you're going to be able to analyse a cartoon from history. We're going to look at a couple of cartoons together, and your homework task is going to be to write up an analysis of one of those three cartoons. So let's do that. Okay, analysing a political cartoon. Some questions you want to ask yourself. Who created the cartoon? Who published it? Yeah, this can tell you quite a lot if there's there might be some bias in the cartoon based on who the person who drew it and who published it. Yeah. For example, newspapers in Australia are all political. On the left wing, you've got The Guardian, which is an online-only newspaper. Then you got The Age, which is left of centre. Then you got the ABC, which is sort of in the middle, maybe a wee bit to the left. Then you got the Herald Sun, and then you got the Australian over here, more right wing. Yeah, there's a big political spectrum. Over here, these are progressives, I guess you could call them, left wing, and over here you got your conservatives, right wing. Anyway, question 2 you should ask yourself, when and where was it published, and what is the significance of the publisher, the time and the place? Yeah, remember, you've got to take into account when it was published. Yeah, it's a common mistake when we're thinking about things from history is to use our modern brain to understand something historical, but we need to place that cartoon, that source, in its context. Okay, if the cartoon was made in the 1970s, what was going on in the 1970s that might change how people interpret that cartoon or that source? Question 3, why was it created? Why does somebody feel the need to make a cartoon about this point? Yeah, it should give you a hint about what the author's purpose was. What political events or issues is it concerned with? What is its message? Political cartoons quite often have bias in them, so what do you think the bias is? Is it biased? It might come through the drawing, it might come through the caption. The more content knowledge you have about the topic being studied, the more likely you are going to be able to figure out what the message is. And question 5, how does it convey its message? What are the features of the drawing? Is it done through caricature? Is it done by making the person look silly? Is it done through language? Yeah, so 4 is, what's the message? 5, how does it get their message across? Okay, right, let's talk about the skills involved. First one is using historical knowledge. Now, all the dot points underneath each of these skills is higher and higher abilities of using that skill. So the lowest level of using historical knowledge is just listing stuff. Like a dot point short sentence with just a bit of info. If your information is relevant, yeah, then that's even better. Yeah, it's a common psychological mistake for people when they read a question that's a bit tricky. They, instead of actually answering the question, they just go, I'll just tell them everything that I know about that topic. The information that you use when you analyze a visual source needs to be relevant to the source. Even better than that, though, is explaining the source using your knowledge. So you've got to have relevant historical knowledge, and then you're going to use that knowledge, not just list it. You're going to use that to explain what's happening in the visual source, what the message is. And the highest level is not only can you explain the source using your knowledge, but you can actually see different categories of knowledge. Yeah, you could see that'll make a bit more sense when we have a look at some of the example ones. But that organising the ideas into categories is very, very high level. Okay, next is establishing the usefulness of the source. How useful is that source to help us understand the past? At the lowest level, you're just listing stuff about the source. Very similar to the using historical knowledge skill. The next level up, you actually do discuss how useful the source is for historians. the next level up, you can see different aspects of the source's usefulness. Yeah, maybe it's got some useful content knowledge, but maybe it's got a little bit of bias, and we can use that bias. That's a separate aspect of the source's usefulness. Yeah, if you can separate out those aspects, then you're doing very well. And the highest level is the level discussing multiple aspects, so more than just one thing about the source that makes it useful or not useful. The top level is that you can actually see how those different aspects of usefulness are different, and you can categorize them. Yeah. So the top level for using historical knowledge and for establishing the usefulness of the source are both about being able to put your ideas into categories. That's high level stuff, people, but I know you can do it. Okay. And the last of the 3 skills that we're focusing on in this video is analyzing elements in the source. So this is more like just a typical what's in it. So if you just list concrete features of the source, oh yeah, it's got 2 guys in it, one of them's throwing the other one a piece of pie or whatever. If you explain features, so explaining is like listing but giving more details, maybe answering the question why or how. It's more than just describing though, okay? Even higher than that is you've explained features of the source, but now you're justifying your explanation. You're going, yeah, that man has more power than that person because of the seating position that they're in, or something like that. Yeah, with examples. You're justifying your explanation with examples from the source. And the highest level is abstract features of the source. That means things that might be emergent, that come out, like power dynamics or stuff like that. That's not just things that have actually been drawn, yeah? Things that are implied in the cartoon. Okay, let's have a look at some cartoons. So here's a cartoon. Now, these are 3 cartoons. I don't know if I'm going to be able to give a good answer for all of them because I'm doing this live. I'm just going to ramble and we'll see how we go. So here's the cartoon. How about a compromise? We keep the land and mineral rights, natural resources, fishing and timber, and will acknowledge you as the traditional owners of it. And we'll try to work through what this cartoon means by looking at the 3 skills that we've focused on at higher and higher levels of ability for each one. So the first skill is using historical knowledge. The lowest level answer for this will just be to list information. Indigenous people lived in Australia before British settlers. Now Indigenous people are considered traditional owners of some land. Boom. I actually already did that, but sorry, yeah, because all the information that I gave was relevant. Yeah, the difference between listing information and using relevant information is if there's a certain amount of irrelevant information. If you bring in some great historical knowledge, but it's got nothing to do with the cartoon, then you're going to get that bottom level. If everything or most of the stuff that you talk about is relevant, you're going to get the next level up. Okay. How might I explain the source using knowledge? I could say, so what was my knowledge was different. I could say the person seated on the left is a judge probably from the British Isles, and we know this because British settlers came to Australia in 1788, and there was a legal decision made in 1992, the Mabo case, which gave Indigenous people traditional rights to the land. Yeah? That's me using my historical knowledge about the legal stuff that went on in the 1990s, the Mabo case in 92, to explain the source. Organising ideas into categories. Okay, so maybe I've got a couple of different ideas that I'm going to help to explain. So maybe I might talk about, so one of my categories would be legal. Yep. So I'll talk about the fact that there's a judge there and laws changed in the 90s recognising traditional rights. And another thing that I might talk about though would be the difference between the 2 cultures. Yeah. One of them's heavily dressed up, sitting in a chair, seeming like he's powerful. You can even see he's got quills and pens there. whereas the indigenous people have got very different clothing, and they've got spears, a spear thrower, and a boomerang. So that might be a couple of different categories. Yeah, I could talk about the cultural difference between the two groups, about how different they are, and then I might talk about the legal cases that were the legal cases in the 90s that developed traditional rights in the first place, like Mabo. How useful is this as a source of information about the past? So if you just listed stuff about it, you get that bottom one. So you might go, it's useful because it tells us about traditional ownership. Discussing it is doing that in a bit more detail. So I might go, this is a useful source of information from the past because it contrasts the different cultural styles of the two different groups, and it points out. So just to go back a little bit, the reason why this cartoon's supposedly funny is because he's saying, yeah, we'll make you traditional owners, that's fine, but we keep the land, we keep the mineral rights so we can mine it whenever we want, we keep all the natural resources, we keep the fishing, we keep the timber, and all we do is we say you are the traditional owners. So what are these indigenous people actually getting out of it? They've just been told that they are the traditional owners, but they don't get the land, they don't get the mining rights, they don't get the natural resources, they don't get the fishing or the timber, right? So that's the setup to the comedy in this. So yeah, right, let's move up to the next one. Discussing multiple aspects of the source's usefulness. So I might talk about the fact that there's no, I might say, I could talk about all that previous stuff about how it was useful, but then I might say we don't know who made this, we don't know when it was made, we don't know which newspaper it was put in. Yeah. Now, if you do an assessment for school, they're probably going to tell you all of that stuff, but in this example, I don't know when it was made. Yeah, this could have been made right. I mean, if this was made before the 1992 Mabo case, then that changes things completely, because what traditional ownership is he talking about? It hasn't actually been determined until the 90s. So multiple aspects of the source's usefulness. As a student of history, it's a really good idea for you to give balanced answers to things. So I would highly recommend that you make some points about it being useful and not so useful. Yeah, that's a good way to discuss multiple aspects. And if I, in my answer, separated those different types of aspects, to get discussing multiple aspects, I might just ramble good points and bad points about its usefulness. If I had a little mini paragraph that said, first, here are some things that suggest the source is useful, cool, and then second, here are some things that make the source not so useful. Yeah, I've separated it into the different aspects through structure of my writing. Finally, analysing elements in the source. If you just list features, there's one man on the left and two men on the right. If I explain features of the source, I go, the man on the left is a judge, possibly a British or a white Australian judge. The two men on the right-hand side are Indigenous Australians. They are referring to, oh sorry, we're still talking about features. We can see that there's a very different level of technology between the two groups and very different clothing styles, blah, blah, blah. Okay. We justify explanation of the source with examples. So take that same stuff I just said, but then I actually refer. So I go, as we can see, you know, the man is wearing red robes and a wig, and the men on the right are wearing very few clothes which are designed for the Australian outback. This shows the difference in the material culture of the two groups. Yeah, you could talk about the different hairstyles. Justifying the explanation means actually referring to things in the source to back up your explanation. Now, if I discussed abstract features of the source, so here's something that you can see in there, but it's not like actually drawn in with pen. The power imbalance, yeah? So the judge is sitting there. He's got all the power. He's in this big chair. It's almost like a throne. He's got a big desk in front of him. You know, you've all heard this saying, the pen is mightier than the sword. Look at that. He's got two pens, and the indigenous people have only got one spear and one boomerang. So an abstract feature of that source, I would say, would be a power imbalance. The man on the left has more power than the two figures on the right-hand side. Now you might want to pause this. I'm not going to spend that much on each. I'm going to get, so there are all of the different levels. Yeah, remember you're aiming to display these 3 skills, the blue skill, the green skill, and the orange skill at the highest level, which is the last dot point. So just pause this video if you need to and see what kinds of answers you can give for these questions at the more difficult levels. One more, which you can do yourself in your own time. Explain that cartoon using those 3 historical sources and trying to do them at the highest level of difficulty as you can. Awesome. We do have a video today. It's analyzing historical cartoons. Take it away.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about analysing cartoons. Now, to really cut this short and not talk too much about what cartoons were, they're very much like the memes that you know today, but in a historical context, they had quite significant value. And as a historian, you can have a look at some of the value by analysing the bits and pieces and the elements of the cartoon. It gives us a better understanding of the ideas and the thoughts and the feelings and the prejudices and the fears that a lot of people had at the time during that part of history, and it will give us a greater, understanding of some of these things that were happening. How do you go about analysing a cartoon? Well, I think it's really important that you ask yourself a few questions. Some of these questions can be easily solved and researched, such as, when was it published, who created it, who published it, where. So they're easy, and often when you do your research, you sort through archival material, all those details will be with it. But some of the other questions you should ask yourself is why it was created. What are some of the messages or symbols within the cartoon? Why would the publishers have found reason to publish it? How's the message being conveyed? And these are all really important questions to ask when analysing it, because you'll get a much better and deeper understanding of that particular part of history. So let's have a look at an example. Okay, so this is one of my favourite cartoons, and one of the reasons why I like it so much is because of the amount of information that is in it. And it tells us a lot about the different prejudices, the different fears, the different ideas that were very much popular during the late 1800s in Australia. Now, as I mentioned before, when analysing a cartoon, there are many questions you need to ask. And the first, obviously, are the basic ones: who created the cartoon, who published it, when was it published, and where. And you can find that information out fairly easily, whether you're doing your own research and you find an original source. Often you'll find it maybe in a newspaper or a magazine. There'll be dates, there will be attributions to the publisher, to the creator, and so a lot of that is kind of easy to come by. But the other questions that perhaps are a little bit more complex are those that are going to be asking you to try and work out what the messages are, what the hidden meanings are, what was the significance of the publisher and the time and place that they published it. Are there symbols being used in there to give us some sort of indication of these fears and prejudices that we're noticing? So in this one in particular, in this particular cartoon, we see and we can identify very quickly that we have in the centre of the image what looks to be like an Asian or Chinese man. He's dressed in Western clothing, he's holding a coconut, he has a pistol drawn into his belt, and he looks to be a little bit of a businessman. And the reason why we have made that determination is because a lot of this information is set out in this poster that is part of the cartoon. And what does it say? It says South Sea Labour Trade. We see that the language that they're using here is sort of language that we don't use nowadays, but in the late 1800s was probably a little bit more socially acceptable. We see that they're for hire, but I'm just wondering, under their own volition, I don't think so. We see chains being used as symbols or images here to suggest that these people haven't come on their own free will, and are now being sold for what? It says here, cash on delivery, or whips, irons, knives and rifles can be taken in exchange. So, you know, it's really painting a dark picture here. But what's really interesting here is not only is it having a go at, you know, the whole notion of Asians coming here and setting up business and bringing in labour from overseas to take jobs from locals. But there's a little bit of a reference here, subtle reference to the fact that, oh, wait a second, maybe it's the actual monarch in England, the king or queen at the time, and whoever was the monarch in 1886, that they've signed off on it and it's all okay. And so that's a really quite a subtle hint that perhaps there is an anti-British sentiment here. So with all the symbols, with all the images and with all the information provided in this cartoon, it really is a good example of how the different ideas and fears and prejudices of Australians during this period of history were conveyed. And like many of the contemporary cartoons at the time, they all kind of followed a similar theme, and they were themes that centred on what Australians valued as in racial terms, in economic terms, in social terms. And like I said, this is a great example of it.
Your reflection activity today, ladies and gentlemen, is a PMI, plus, minus, interesting. So the topic being analysing historical cartoons. What's one plus about that? What's one minus about that? And what's one interesting thing? Just 3 really simple phrases or dot points. Your homework, we looked at one cartoon in depth. I want you to pick one of those 3 cartoons. You can look at the one in depth, or you can look at one of the other 2, and I want you to write a short paragraph analysing it, yeah? So maybe 150, 200 words minimum, and you're going to take a photo of that and share it with me. Your bonus homework for those of you who are keen as beans is to read chapter 1.8 from History Alive 10. That is a chapter about analysing historical cartoons. It's not about this topic, but it's in the overview chapter, so it's still relevant. Thank you so much for taking part in today's lesson. I do appreciate it. And as I always say, keep it real.